Thank you. I know we're all tired after a whole day of conference. Who let that guy in? Ladies and gentlemen, the great statesman Sir Winston Churchill once noted, with customary astuteness, that a pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, while an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. In this vein, I posit that the current global financial crisis, though potentially perilous, may in effect present a golden opportunity for us in ASEAN. While it is true that the traditional consumer markets of the West are now sinking in a sea of debt, thereby causing direct and substantial impact to our export-oriented economies, it is also true that industrial production and exports has begun to cautiously accelerate in the region. Momentum in the last 1 year has been positive, with contracting demand from America and Europe offset by growing demand in the region, especially from China. And in fact, statistics from the last 3 quarters of last year reveal that Southeast Asian consumption expenditure had expanded by a healthy 4.7%. This interesting trend suggests that domestic demand in East Asia is not only able to withstand the global financial pressures from the West, but also reveals the potential of this region to become the next major consumer market, as alluded earlier by His Excellency Mr. Visit. This is particularly significant to us, geographically bridging the rising giants of East Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and with more than 600 million people, or nearly a tenth of the world's population living in ASEAN, we are well poised to take advantage of this emerging development. However, it is imperative that we tread carefully. This promised opportunity is double-edged. While we must be prepared to realize the possible and potential benefits of economic growth, we must also take great care in leveraging on this opportunity to ensure that any development that results in one that is equitable, just, and inclusive. And this is where our public institutions are critical. If our executive, legislative, judicial, financial, electoral systems are not robust, are not durable, and even more importantly, are not clean, then we will not be able to safeguard the fundamental rights and well-being of our people. That said, economic opportunities are rife with pitfalls. In a capitalistic environment, unfettered by the absence of strong, functional, and accountable public institutions, it is only too easy to fall into either one or both, either one or two of these traps. Firstly, corruption and abuse of power usually thrive in such circumstances. As a result, state monopoly capitalism and rent-seeking behavior will lead to an inefficient economy that benefits only politically connected capitalists and those adept at the art of bureaucratic lubrication. In this case, economic development will occur, but corruption will produce inequitable development. The other trap is known as the tragedy of the commons, a dilemma characterized by independent, rational actors in singular pursuit of their own self-interest. This behavioral pattern is unsustainable and will ultimately result in long-term ruin as resources are greedily exhausted without regard for collective consciousness. In this case, everyone for himself will mean that the biggest, strongest, and richest will amass the lion's share, while everyone else will be left fighting for scraps. So in the context of ASEAN today, with some member countries in a state of transitional flux and others still entrenched in the old habits of patronage, corruption, abuse of power, it would be only too easy to fall into either one or both of these traps. And so the only way to prevent such adverse circumstances is to provide the necessary institutional protections through good and clean governance based on the rule of law, legitimacy of power, consistency and integrity in public service delivery, and participatory processes that will provide every man and woman with a real and lasting stake in their own future. Ladies and gentlemen, There are, of course, those who argue against the need for values such as freedom and democracy as a basis for clean governance. In their opinion, the peculiarities of Asian values make democracy and human rights incompatible with the genetic makeup of our society. And I believe Dato' Ambiga spoke on this earlier. I fully agree. What they argue is that economic needs are more important than human rights and political freedoms, and that development can in fact be achieved without freedom. This is, of course, the hypothesis of the absolute benign dictator, most recently postulated by a prominent former prime minister. In fact, only a few weeks ago, I was attending his talk, and he talked about the best government, the best form of government in the world is an absolute benign dictatorship. Now, of course, such a leader would indeed be powerful and strong enough to engender efficient and effective functioning of public institutions. The system will work as intended only so long as the dictator is inclined to be benign and benevolent. Unfortunately, no one has told us what will happen when the dictator eventually decides one day that he will not be benign after all. Advocates of this thesis often point out that the development and freedom are not necessarily mutually inclusive. After all, some Asian economies have been able to achieve development without necessarily giving due regard to freedom and human rights. However, here we must ask ourselves an important question. To whom does development benefit, and what do we mean by development? To address the first question, it is often the case that economic development in authoritarian regimes, even with double-digit expansion, results only in one-sided distribution and widening inequality. In other words, while the pie gets bigger, the crumbs for those at the bottom do not increase. It is only the elite that enjoy the excesses. Secondly, development should not only be measured in material terms. While the escape from income poverty must be a goal, development should also entail the release of the shackles of unfreedom, to use the term made famous by Amartya Sen. In other words, societal development can only be achieved when people are empowered with the freedom to live their lives to their fullest capabilities. That is the only way to ensure sustainable and equitable development. Ladies and gentlemen, this Asian values thesis is a fallacy, and at best a justification for authoritarian regimes. We must remember that democracy, which is the structural manifestation of freedom, is founded upon the derivation of legitimacy from the masses. Though it is a Western term, it is not a Western concept. As Kim Dae-jung pointed out in his seminal rebuttal against the notion of Asian values, Chinese philosophy, dating as far back as a few millennia ago, have already been advancing the idea that the heavenly mandate of the rulers were not only derived from the will of the people, but also predicated upon good and righteous governance. And this, mind you, was long before John Locke articulated the foundations of modern democracy. In other words, the fundamental values and traditions for democracy are not peculiar to the West or to the East. They are, in fact, universal human values. Therefore, Asian cultural heritage is not an obstacle, but a platform to foster and encourage the values of freedom and democracy. In this regard, the challenge for us is to ensure the embodiment of these values into our public institutions. And this is something that only we can do ourselves. The responsibility to exercise clean, efficient, accountable governance in ASEAN cannot be imposed or cannot be imported from the outside. After all, it is our own freedom, our own development, and our own livelihood that is at stake. Thus, it is entirely incumbent upon us to meet this challenge of ensuring that our public institutions embrace the universal values of truth, freedom, and democracy. And if I may conclude, summarize the day's proceedings, the ideas that have been suggested and talked about, discussed today, as we look towards this future that promises both challenges and opportunity, it is critical that we get our foundations right. We must resist the urge to retreat into our own comfort zones. We need to recognize that only by a collective regional effort can we build a substantial force to face the coming shift in the global order. The key to building sustainable development is to empower our people through the adherence of the fundamental principles of truth, freedom, and democracy. It is our duty to ensure that development and its distribution is not only fair materially, but also inclusive in terms of access and opportunity. To do this, we must avoid the pitfalls of selfishness and corruption. We must also take heed that freedom and democracy are not concepts that are anathema to our culture. They are in fact symbiotic values and must be embraced in order to achieve the ultimate goal of human development. At the end of the day, whether we call it clean governance, good governance, or judicious governance, it is about building strong, functioning, accountable, and transparent public institutions. Only then can we reduce the avenues for corruption, provide representation for all levels of society, allow meaningful space for democratic participation, and be responsive to the present and future needs of our society. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope everyone had a good conference today. I would like to end by thanking everyone who has helped make this conference a success. Thank you to the State Government of Penang, and in particularly the Chief Minister and his office for facilitating this event, the State Secretary's office for the assistance, the Municipal Councils of Penang Island and Province Wellesley, the Eastern and Oriental Hotel for their gracious assistance and support, the Royal Thai Consulate and other diplomats who have supported us, the distinguished speakers who have come from many, many countries to be with us here today, and of course our friends from the media. Last but not least, I would like to thank my very, very hardworking colleagues from the Penang Institute, without whom this would not have been a success. With that, I say thank you, and hopefully to come back again next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zairil. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the conclusion of today's event. On behalf of Penang Institute and Penang Monthly, we thank all of you who made the effort to come here today in the name of clean governance. Please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you and good night.